Hi, I'm Alexa.
And I'm Chen.
And we're at Wrong Side Studios, and this is the Sew Along for Our Painter's Pullover. So the first step is doing a lot of serging or finishing the edges. And we're going to be doing that on several different pieces. The most important thing with finishing these edges is that you don't want to cut into any of the seam lines. You don't want to cut into the fabric. So if you're using a serger, put that knife away. We are going to be doing the arm pieces along the sides. I've pre-serged this one here. We are going to be doing the front and back pieces right along that neck and shoulder, and then on the sides. And then we're gonna be serging the short sides and the bottom of the facings. So I'll show you exactly how to do that now.
Second part is we're gonna do the patch pocket. So what you're gonna do is distinguish the right side from the wrong side of the patch pocket, turn it to the wrong side, and then fold the top of the patch pocket 1/2 inch down and press. Next thing you're gonna wanna do is turn it to the right side and fold it down another 1/2 inch. Basically, so you have like a little accordion fold right here. And then press. Then we're gonna take it to the sewing machine. And once you've gotten to the machine, you're gonna want to sew a straight stitch down from the top of the pocket just to where the end of where you folded. And then make sure you do that on the other side as well. All right, now that you have the corners kind of sewn down, you're gonna wanna snip the corners. And what you're doing is reducing bulk when you turn it over. You'll see what I mean. You got the corners snipped. What you're gonna wanna do is turn the whole thing inside out. Use a point turner to get those corners nice and crispy. All right, now you've got the top of your patch pocket practically done. You're gonna wanna press just to make sure that top corner is super distinctive and it's gonna look really great.
So what I just did is I stitched along the top from the right side. That's a top stitch. I used a top stitching thread, which is a little bit thicker because I'm using a denim fabric that can kind of handle it. If you are using a top stitching thread, use a longer stitch length. I put mine to 4. But you can use any contrasting color, matching color, whatever you want.
What you're gonna wanna do is press all around so that when you attach the patch pocket to the sleeve, you're gonna have like a nice uniform little patch pocket. You're gonna use a 1/2 inch seam allowance when you're pressing. You're gonna do this on all of the sides. Perfect little pocket.
Now I'm gonna take this patch pocket, and where you put the markings on one of the sleeves before, you just align the top corners to those markings, and then we will pin in place. We're gonna sew the patch pocket onto the sleeve. I'm gonna start right at the edge, go all the way around, pivot, and come back around so it has like a nice little double stitch. Just to secure the edges, I'm gonna do a quick little bar tack across the top.
Now we're gonna do the long pocket that goes across the front of your pullover. We have it so that the right side is the side that gets, the right side of the long pocket, not the right side of the fabric, gets the pocket flap. So if you need to distinguish it somehow on your fabric, please mark it. But yeah, we're gonna do basically the same routine that we did with the patch pocket here. You're gonna turn it to the wrong side and then half an inch down, turn it half an inch down for seam allowance, and then press. And then same routine as last time, turn it over to the right side, and then press down another half inch, accordion style. Now take it back to the sewing machine and we're gonna do basically the same thing we did for the patch pocket. With a half inch seam allowance, stitch down just to where you folded. And then do the same on the other side. Now we're gonna do the same thing that we did on patch pocket. Basically clip the corners so that when you tuck it in, it doesn't bulge. Same on the other side. And then use a point turner to make those corners nice and pointy. Press it down.
Same as the patch pocket, we are going to top stitch along the top of this.
All right, now we're gonna basically do the same thing that we did on the patch pocket, which is press half an inch in on all sides other than the top.
Now we're going to attach the long pocket to the front body piece. So the back and the front look similar, so just make sure you're doing the front. In the pattern, the flap goes on the right side. We've decided to switch it around for this garment we're making, just for fun, so we've marked it on the other side, but it's the same exact process. What you're going to do is, on these markings you made, you're going to line up the corners. Line up the corners on all the sides. And we're gonna pin this in place. And we have the two markings for the corners of the flap. And again, in the pattern, if you're following it exactly, yours will be on the other side. We've just switched it for this one. Now we are going to top stitch along the edge and then come back around and do the double stitch look just like we did on the patch pocket. And I'm now going to just bar tack the corners to give them a little extra strength. And then we are going to stitch down along these lines. And it's up to you whether you want to do a single stitch or a double. I'm going to do a double just because I want it to be a little extra reinforced. So you'll see, because I did a double, I just kind of used that line I drew to act as like the middle and stitch around it. But if you're just doing a single, you can just stitch right along that line. I'm also gonna do a little bar tack here. Now we're gonna sew the flap together. So we're gonna take both pieces of this flap and you're gonna put it right sides together and just align the edges and pin them in place. And then we're going to stitch it with the 1/2 inch seam allowance. And we're gonna start here at the upper right-hand corner and just go all the way around, leaving that top open. So we've stitched that together, but we've left the top free. And then what we're going to do is trim the seam allowance, being really careful not to cut into the stitch line. But this just reduces the bulk, so when we turn it out, it's a little bit easier to do so. And then you're going to take the flap, turn it right side out, and use that point turner to get into the edges. Just make sure everything's kind of pushed out. And then we're going to take it over to the iron and press it.
All right, now we're going to press this guy so that it looks really crisp and clean. If you're using a thicker fabric, what I usually like to do is reach inside and push the seam allowance out so that you're catching the innermost edge and you're getting, you know, the most for your press, as no one says but me.
You're just going to top stitch along here, same as we did before, right along the edge, and then pivoting. You can do one line on here or double. Again, it's up to you.
All right, now we're gonna place a pocket flap. So where you've just top stitched, or wherever the front of the flap that's gonna be facing people is, flip it over so that basically it's pointing upwards. And then put the corners exactly where you have notched or placed your markings, and then pin very carefully. Great, and there you have it. All right, now that you've had your pocket flap pinned, we're taking it to the machine and we're gonna sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way across. It can be kind of hard to see your seam allowance, so you feel free to measure with a ruler. We're just gonna eyeball it. 1/2 inch seam allowance is what we usually do, so pretty used to it by now. Now what you're gonna wanna do is basically trim the seam allowance that you've just sewed, this 1/2 inch that you just sewed. And the reason why you're doing that is that when you fold the pocket over, we're gonna stitch again and we're gonna encase that seam allowance under it. So you don't have to finish it. We're taking this pocket flap back to the iron so that we can flip it. Look, that looks like a real pocket flap, and then press this down so that it's gonna look really crisp, and we're gonna have an easier time sewing it. Now that we have our pocket flap pressed down, we're gonna wanna sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance just under the top edge. So basically we're encasing this raw edge underneath so that it doesn't have to be finished.
Now we're gonna sew the facings together, and they're quite similar, so I always mark on mine which is the front and which is the back. So that's just a little tip. So this is the front facing and we have the back facing, and we're gonna put it right sides together, and we're going to line it up on these short sides and pin it in place. And then we're gonna sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance on these short sides. And now the neck facing is together, and we're gonna take it over to the iron and press these seams apart. So we're just gonna press these. We're gonna take the front body and the back body and place them right sides together. And you're going to be aligning here at the shoulder and neck. And we're going to first start at one edge and then the other end. And then kind of pin in between. And then we're gonna take that over to the sewing machine and sew it. And we're gonna sew this with the 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then we're gonna do it on the other side. We're gonna take what we just sewed and press those seam allowances open. Now we're going to take this and turn it right side out, like this. And we are going to have our facing sort of wrong side out. And find the front. So I've marked my front. I'm going to make sure it matches up with the front of the garment. I'm going to slide it right over the neck there. And then what we're going to do is align the center notches and just pin those in place. You're also going to align the side seams, and we want to make sure these are still pressed open so that when we sew over it, it sews it down flat. So both of those pressed open, line up those seams, pin it, and then we're going to take the center notches here again, pin those. And then the same thing with this other side seam. And then we're just going to continue pinning around. We're going to take it over to the sewing machine.
Okay, now you're going to want to sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance along the entire neckline. And what you want to be really careful of is when you're sewing over the seams, side seams, that these seam allowances are pressed out. I usually start at the seam allowance just so I can get started on that right foot. So, yep, these are all pressed flat. We're all good there. I'm going to go ahead and remove this pin. and start sewing. And there you have it. Neckline sewn all the way around. Then you're gonna want to trim your seam allowance. So now you have a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so trimming it to 1/4. And the reason you're doing this is that in order to avoid finishing the seams and to avoid a lot of excess bulk in the neckline, when we flip this over and stitch around the neckline to secure it, it'll have encased that seam. So now you're going to flip your collar up and over. So the facing tucks in within the neckline. You might need to adjust as you press.
Okay, so we're going to put that back on the sewing machine and top stitch around the neckline with that 1/2 inch seam allowance. And there you have it sewn down. So at this point, if you want, and this is optional, you can tack down the facing. So this stitch on the top helps it lay flat, but if you want it to be extra secure, you can do a couple of hand stitches or machine stitches if you want, just right here along that seam, and make sure both of those seams are lined up, and that just kind of holds the facing down. This is an optional step though. Now we're going to attach the arms. And you're going to lay this out flat, right side up. And we're going to start with this arm. So we just want this to be kind of out flat like this. And we're going to take one of our sleeves. It doesn't matter which one, but you do want to make sure that these are right sides together. And we're going to start by pinning our center notch with the seam, with the shoulder seam. So just make sure that's really accurate, and then that this is still pressed flat. And then we are going to pin at each of the ends. And then this part can be a little tricky, so you just want to go slow. But because these are both curves, you're just going to want to kind of stretch the fabric in between as you go. You just kind of manipulate around the curves and use a lot of pins if you need to. These do fit together, although it might seem at first that they won't. But it's just the going slow, using a lot of pins, and stretching the fabric that will get it to fit, just like this. And now that whole arm is pinned, and we're going to take it over and sew it on the machine. We are going to sew with the 1/2 inch seam allowance. And just take it kind of slow if you need to around the curves. And make sure as you go that the fabric underneath is flat. So that might just mean that you're kind of moving things around a little bit. And make sure as you're going over the shoulder seam that the seam is pressed out flat. And then we're just gonna do that same thing with the other arm. Okay, so we're gonna take that seam allowance where we just sewed the sleeve to the body and we're gonna serge it. And this time you can use the knife.
All right, now that you've finished that seam, we're gonna wanna press the seam allowance inward towards the sleeve.
Okay, so take the end of one sleeve and we're gonna pre-press the hem so it's easier to sew later. So we are going to flip it with the wrong side up, wrong side together there. You're gonna press down a 1/2 inch. And then you're gonna fold it in again, another 1/2 inch. Okay, so the next step is to sew the sides together. So we have this pre-pressed hem on the sleeve. We're gonna unfold that, bring the sides together, and pin there at the edge, right sides together. And we're gonna take this whole side and pin along the entire length of it. Again, right sides together. So we're gonna pin at the end of the sleeve. Then I like to connect the underarm seam and pin right there so that's aligned. And then I pin right above this hem split here. When you sew this along the side, you stop right here where the hem split starts. You don't keep going. So we're gonna stop right there. So just put the pin there and that's a good place to stop. And then just pin through the middle. Go back to the sleeve and kind of pin your sleeve. And then we're gonna take this machine and sew all the way along the side. We're gonna start at the end of the sleeve and sew with the 1/2 inch seam allowance. And you're gonna stop right where that hem split starts. So just stop right there. And now we're gonna take this over to the iron and press these seams open.
All right, now we're gonna press the seam allowance open like we have been doing with a lot of the seams here. And now we're gonna iron down the hem split so that it's gonna be super easy for you to sew when you get to the sewing machine. I'll just give this another press. Just to make sure it's super crispy, that edge. And then what you're gonna wanna do is you already have the seam allowance that you've sewed down to. What you're gonna wanna do is take this raw edge and then fold it basically to the edge of where you pressed, which is gonna be 1/2 inch. So basically this hem split is 1 inch, you're gonna fold it in 1/2 inch and then fold it over so that this line is flush and that raw edge is encased. So I'm gonna go ahead and iron that, but I'm gonna do that the same thing on the other side and press.
And then we're gonna take it to the machine and sew it down.
Now that you have ironed down the hem split, you're gonna wanna turn the whole garment right side out, right side facing up. And then make sure that, you know, what you've pressed so hard for is still also encased in the seam allowance here. And basically what we're gonna do is we're gonna sew all the way around the hem split, cut across the top, and then around the other side. We recommend doing, since we have a 1/2 inch seam allowance, recommend doing about a 3/8 seam allowance here. So now that you've sewn the hem split, you're gonna wanna reinforce this right here, just so that it doesn't really pull apart if, you know, something happens. You're gonna want a bar tack right along the edge here where the two hem splits meet. There you go, you've reinforced that.
Okay, so now we're gonna hem the sleeve, and some of the sizes don't quite fit easily around the sewing machines like this one. And that's okay. We're gonna show you how to sew that. Some of them will fit nicely around. So just kind of make sure when you're folding this back over that the garment is right side out. You should have these press lines where you pressed before. Make sure this seam is pressed open on the inside and just kind of fold it back over where you previously pressed it. And this is why we pre-press, because now it's nice and flat. If you want to kind of pin that in place, you can. So this one, because it doesn't fit on the sewing machine, what we're gonna have to do is just slide it under, and we're gonna be sewing this hem with a 3/8 seam allowance. And you just wanna make sure as you go around, there's no fabric underneath that shouldn't be there. So we're gonna go slow. Moving all the fabric out of the way. We just want that hem under there. And there you have it.
Time for the last step of this whole process. We've turned the garment wrong side out so that we can hem the bottom of the pullover. So we're gonna basically turn up the hem 1/2 inch and then another 1/2 inch and press. All right, now that we've turned it up 1/2 inch and press, we're gonna wanna do that just again. Once you've done that, don't forget to do it on the other side. Then we're gonna go back to the sewing table.
Okay, so you're gonna take the garment and you're gonna flip it so the right side is out, and we are going to hem from the right side with a 3/8 seam allowance. We're gonna do that on the back side as well. And it's done. All right, now you should have a finished painter's pullover.